Let's start with what, are you recording?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's start with what was successful in the lesson and what you're feeling good about.
So the lesson was actually a letter to the teacher. In Lucy, every 6 lessons, she writes a letter and says you might try this, you might try this. And it's like a narrative of what the gist of it is, and her purpose is so that you get into the habit of writing lessons.
Good.
And
thank you, Lucy, for
it's usually all there.
That way.
Yeah, it's usually all there, but I actually changed it because the way that she had it, a couple of things. So the lesson was about becoming your own reading coach.
Okay.
But there was no demo. So it went straight into active engage. So I added the demo.
Okay.
Where I sticky noted with the common text that they'd known and said, watch me as I look for the standard. And I did that because I needed the process to be really transparent of they've been working on so many things. So you need to see how I find this on the rubric. And then I also chose a really common misconception where they add extraneous details. So then the other thing that I modified was in the lesson, it has them use, for the active engage, it has them look at a sticky note about a gorillas text we used at the very beginning of the unit. And I was like, gosh, I'm going to have to reread the text. And I was like, this is not connected. So then I went back to the text they read for homework last night.
Got it.
And I chose the summary and a common misconception for the students. And so my intention there was that the text would be fresh in their mind, which didn't turn out to be the case.
Yeah.
And then, again, when I wanted them to independently practice. So it's a little bit of an unusual lesson in that she said you could have them all practice this right now with blank. And I did choose to do that because I was looking at the way she wrote and I was like, the lesson is about self-assessing, but she's like, watch me become a coach and then go off and read. And I felt like it was really disconnected to the teaching point.
Actually
self-assess. So I wanted them to practice that self-assessment piece. And I said, oh, this is a perfect opportunity because we all did homework with cross-text synthesis. And I know cross-text synthesis is going to be really challenging. So I was like, this is going to be perfect. But it ended up being way more challenging. So back to the pros. I jotted them to myself while I was reflecting at recess. So I picked I wrote the teaching point and then also chose 2 really clear.
Your process was really, really clear.
And then, so I think the process was my intention of making it clear of look over your notes, think what's the skill or strategy I'm practicing, find it on the rubric, think what am I doing well, what am I doing better, jot a coaching tip. So I thought that was clear. I also thought I'm proud of myself for giving them choice because it was a really hard text and a really hard skill and a really hard, self-assessing is really hard. So I tried to really model that.
Yeah.
I felt like it was hard during, so I was really modeling that. And again, I added the modeling and the independent practice at the rug. So it was an unusual layout for the workshop.
There was more in this lesson than is usually in
definitely.
lesson.
And even so, I felt like it was still on pace.
Yes.
However, the pacing I thought was good. I thought it was clear. And I thought their engagement was really high in my teach at the beginning.
Yep.
I knew I lost them when they were looking at their notes and they were like, this is not cross-text synthesis. Some of them weren't taking out their rubric.
Some of them didn't have their homework.
They all had their homework, and I made sure of it this morning, and I looked it over.
Oh, so some of them didn't take out their homework.
And because I knew that's definitely an issue often, which is why homework has been such an issue for reading because it's authentic every day.
Yeah.
And so I had them all take it out and I placed the pink sticky note and I said, bring your homework with the pink sticky note and your rubric so that they're ready to go at the rug. And then we still had kids being like, where is it? And I was so confused about the materials because I knew that was an issue. So I had jotted notes when I roamed to check in on their homework, and I knew most of them, my anticipated misconception was that most of them had written 2 summaries, which is perfect. You write 2 summaries now, discern the subtopic.
Yeah.
Given that, I knew that some of my small groups were going to be on summary writing because some of their summaries weren't strong.
Okay.
So that was going to be my intended mid-workshop, is like, wow, some of you are looking at your cross-text synthesis and you're realizing my summaries aren't very strong to discern my subtopic. I'm going to set a coaching intention around summary writing. But I just didn't feel like they were there. So that's what I pulled the small group for. That's why I was like, oh, I'm just going to pull those 3 and they can handle it.
To do that particular.
Okay. The rest, I was like, so the other thing that was challenging, I think, was that, and I let this be the case and I let them struggle, was
which is a strength.
We modeled on something that was different from the independent practice, because in real life we're not all going to be practicing the same things at the same time, and that's why the process was so important, of like looking at your sticky note and thinking, what's the strand I need to align this to, and then reading the rubric. And there are just so many parts. It's like
there was a lot in that
so
lesson.
much cognition, metacognition of like, okay, here I'm going to pick it, now I'm going to read it, now I'm going to read the strand, now I'm going to think about the parts I'm doing my strand. Now I'm going to make a coaching point. So I knew all those were there. So I knew it would be, I've said this several times, this is the beginning of this work. It's going to feel really hard. I think I anticipated a little more success in them doing it all together on a shared text. But I think because the text itself was so challenging, like maybe I should have chosen a much shorter text, or I felt a little off when I went to go confer, because I was like, whoa, I need to confer on like entirely different, which is fine. I often do that, but I felt like they were a little frazzled about going back. When normally they're like so eager to go back and get started, and because they were so off, but I knew that I had to just get them off the rug to go read. Yeah. So I thought
that was a really smart decision to be like, okay, stop here.
Off you go.
Off you go. So like, yeah, you're right. Pacing was still strong even in a really challenging lesson. And what your objective of the lesson around being a strong reader, who I'm also taking notes if you, I will send them to you.
Oh, great.
But you can take notes. Like, I know your process. That your objective around your building your coaching lens for yourself as a reader, and there's a process to that. I thought that was really clear. And I think kids understood the process. I think applying that process
was a lot for a lot of kids.
Yeah, it was a lot for a lot of kids. But the objective itself was clear. There was great choice in the lesson around what they were going to go and do this on. You know, the things that make workshop teaching.
And I will say that, like, I sat with this lesson a good 2 hours trying to figure out, this isn't clear. So, like, I think Lucy's smarter than me, but, like, I don't know.
There was too much in that lesson.
Well, there were just a lot of disconnects.
Yeah.
The way it was originally written. So I think I tightened it, but I think it's one of those things that we do in shared read for a week as a class. And we did that. Like, I anticipated cross-text synthesis is super hard. And so we wrote a week of shared writing, and that's where you walked into the endangered frogs. I, like, wrote that week for teachers to just sit in shared reading, because this is such a hard strand. And I think the continual challenge is what I said to them, is that the more you grow as readers, you're going to have harder text to synthesize.
Yep. I'm wondering around some of the language that you're using in these lessons and that shows up in these rubrics, and how well students are understanding the language itself. So you had one student asked a question in the lesson about the word sequence. And that was the one question that kids had on the carpet. But I really wonder, how well do they understand some of the other very high-level academic language that you're using in the mini lessons?
We use the rubric all the time. So they should, and it's part of all our teaching points. They should know what a summary is. Now, applying it is different. Like, do I really know how to do this well? So I think it's one of those things of, like, both parts are hard.
Yeah.
You know?
How did you feel about their understanding of cross-text synthesis?
I don't think they understood it today.
Okay.
And that's why I was so surprised, because we've talked about it and it was their homework last night, and so I was like, is this because the text is so challenging that you really struggled to do it and now you don't know how to fix it because you can't access the text? Because that's why I was saying I expected them to be more successful with the shared process, even though I knew it was a challenging strategy, because we've talked about it a lot. It's definitely not what we've done. You know, we haven't done it this week as a class, but it's like we've introduced it for sure. There's definitely an ongoing.
What do you think might be the root cause of the struggle in the shared?
That I think they struggled to understand what cross-text synthesis was, and they struggle with the text.
Okay.
And so then they couldn't apply either. It's like, I don't really clearly know what cross-text synthesis is. Whereas when they did frogs, it was like, oh, both texts are teaching us about. And like, that wasn't the focus of my lesson either. It was like, let's really understand what cross-text synthesis is. So,
so there was so much cognitive demand in every aspect of this lesson that it was hard to hone in on the objective of the lesson. So I think what I'd like you to consider, and I know you put a ton of time into planning this and had a lot of like strong preparation for the groups that you anticipated. I think if your cognitive demand on the text is high, your cognitive demand on the skill is high, and your cognitive demand on the process is high, that's going to overwhelm your class. Yeah. So how can you adjust you know, which one is going to be low or familiar enough that's not the struggle?
Totally. I guess like because there's been so much choice in their jotting, I wanted there to be a shared practice piece, and they had just done it for homework. So like if I were to do it again, I would have read ahead and been like, okay, summarize this tonight. I would have changed the homework. Okay. Summarize this tonight, come back with it tomorrow, and then use that as a self-assess piece. I wanted it to be varied between the demo and the, it just happened to be, like you said, are really hard. So I would have, so like the two options I could see would be to change the homework so that the night before they would have a shared text, and the other would be go into your reader's notebook and find a strategy you've been working on. Yeah. But that would have been super hard.
That's because a whole other step of the process.
Yeah, their jotting could have, like, some of their jots don't naturally align to the rubric. Like, a lot of kids have been experimenting with timelines. And it's like, how do I haven't necessarily tagged that for all kids to the rubric. So, that's why I was like, okay, I want to use a shared text. And I was like, shoot. Okay, it's going to be fine. They know this. So, I think, in retrospect, it would have been more foresight. And again, it's okay. It's the first time. But it would have been more foresight.
You could also divide out this lesson across a few different lessons where first it's how well do I understand this rubric and can just like identify where in my reading I am doing this. I think that in itself is a step of this process that's really complicated. I don't know.
Even if, well, because their sticky notes are all varied.
And because I don't know how well they understand the language of this rubric. This is a really intense rubric. Right? It's not incredibly student friendly. At least for, you know, students who are also grappling with the academic language that we're putting in them.
I don't know. I feel like we've used the rubric a lot. I think that nonfiction's been way harder. I mean, The Last Bend has been challenging for us as adults. We have been understanding that informational texts have narratives and cross-assessing our ability to read narratives within informational, and that's
reading
and changing the lens. And so it's been so demanding for them to be like, wait, what? This is nonfiction narrative, like, because we drilled into them at an early age, like nonfiction, fiction, and now it's suddenly like nonfiction is reading to learn about through a narrative. And so like I think,
and where they're going is in 4th grade they're going to learn that they can in writing include like short narratives within biographies, say, or like